The night Lena Kowalczyk saved a man's life, she was wearing rubber gloves and had a mop bucket wedged between her knees. She hadn't planned to be there. She'd switched shifts with Danny because Danny's kid had a fever, and Lena didn't have kids, didn't have plans, didn't have anything on a Tuesday night except leftover butter chicken and a library book she'd been trying to finish for 3 weeks. So she'd said yes, the way she always said yes, and showed up at Meridian Tower at 9:30 with her cart and her earbuds, and the quiet expectation that the 42nd floor would be empty. It was not empty. The low rumble of men's voices through the frosted glass of the boardroom, the clipped sound of someone speaking in a language that wasn't English. She'd stopped walking. The cleaning contract was clear. If a floor was occupied after hours, you noted it on the log and moved on. You did not knock. You did not enter. You left them to their business, whatever that business was. But Lena had already pushed the door open 3 inches before she understood what she was walking into. The room held 14 men. Most of them were in suits that cost more than her yearly salary. 2 were standing near the windows, not looking at the city lights behind them, looking at the man at the head of the table. That man, early 50s, silver hair swept back, the kind of jaw that suggested he'd broken it at least once, was speaking in Ukrainian. His voice was controlled, but the veins in his neck were not. Lena didn't run. She should have. Instead, she did the only thing her body knew how to do when she was frightened, which was to go completely, utterly still. She understood every word he said. The man at the head of the table was Rowan Ashford, though she didn't know that yet. She only knew that the silver-haired man had just told the 2 men by the window, in Ukrainian, that Ashford's legal team didn't understand the clause, and that they were going to let them walk away thinking they'd won something, when in fact they'd just signed over port access rights that would cost them 8 figures within the year. The woman beside Ashford, slim, dark-suited, the kind of polished that came from very expensive education, was on her feet, speaking in what she clearly believed was flawless Ukrainian. It was not flawless. Her accent was Kyiv-adjacent, but her vocabulary was textbook, not street, and she'd missed the idiomatic turn in the clause entirely. She was congratulating them on their partnership. She was radiating confidence. The silver-haired man's lips twitched, not a smile. Something colder. Lena stood in the doorway with her mop bucket and thought, "They don't know then," she thought. "Not your problem." Then the silver-haired man said, still in Ukrainian, still perfectly calm, "We'll let him keep thinking he's the one who walked away well." Lena took a breath. She wheeled her cart to the side of the room, parked it against the wall, and walked to Rowan Ashford's end of the table. The room went silent in the way that only happens when something has occurred that nobody has a script for. 14 men looked at a woman in a navy cleaning uniform with a laminated Meridian Services badge clipped to her chest and her hair coming out of its elastic. The polished woman froze mid-gesture. One of the men near the window put his hand inside his jacket. Ashford looked at her. He had grey eyes and the expression of a man who had not been surprised in a very long time and was currently being surprised. "I need a moment," Lena said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "With you now, please." Nobody moved. "She's the cleaning staff," the polished woman said, in the tone people use when they want to end a conversation without having to make an argument. "Yes," Lena said, and she didn't look at her. She looked at Ashford. "Your interpreter just congratulated them on a partnership. What Mr. Kovalenko actually said, what he said in the last 90 seconds, was that your team doesn't understand what you've agreed to. He said the port access clause runs concurrent with a secondary rights provision that your counsel hasn't flagged. He's planning to invoke it in 14 months. Silence, not the polite kind, the airless kind. Kovalenko, the silver-haired man, had gone very still. Ashford said, quietly, "Say that again." So she did. In Ukrainian, she turned to Kovalenko and repeated, word for word, what he had said. Then she translated it back to English, watching Ashford's face. And then she said, also in Ukrainian, that she would appreciate it if the gentleman near the window would remove his hand from his jacket, because she wasn't a threat to anyone, and she'd like to keep it that way. Kovalenko stared at her for a long, assessing moment. Then he laughed. Not the laugh of a man who'd been caught, the laugh of a man who had just encountered something genuinely unexpected and found it more interesting than threatening. He said, in Ukrainian, "Where did you find her?" Ashford said in English, "I'm going to need a few minutes." He stood. He looked at his polished interpreter. He looked at his legal team, all three of them with their matching leather portfolios and their matching expressions of not quite understanding what had just happened. Then he looked at Lena. "With me," he said. She followed him into the small anteroom off the boardroom. He closed the door. Through the glass, she could see the room rearranging itself nervously. The legal team huddling, Kovalenko pouring himself a glass of water with the patience of a man who was used to waiting. The man by the window finally taking his hand out of his jacket. Ashford turned to face her. "Lena Kowalczyk," she said, because she felt like she should say something, and the name on her badge seemed like a reasonable place to start. "I work for Meridian Services. I usually do floors 38 through 41, but Danny's kid has a fever." He looked at her for a moment that felt much longer than it was. "How many languages do you speak?" "7. 8 if you count Latin, which most people don't." "What's the clause?" she told him. Clearly, the port access provision ran under a secondary rights arrangement that was buried in Schedule C of the original draft, page 41, subsection 4. The way it was worded in Ukrainian, specifically the phrase Kovalenko had used, which had a very particular legal connotation in Eastern European trade agreements from the post-2009 framework. It would allow his company to invoke a renegotiation of all access fees once the initial partnership had been in operation for 14 months. Ashford's team had almost certainly seen the English translation of Schedule C. They had almost certainly not seen the problem, because the translation had flattened the meaning of that phrase into something harmless. Ashford was quiet. He had the quality of very dangerous men when they are thinking. Perfect stillness, very little expression. "Eyes that why are you telling me this?" he said finally. It was a fair question. She'd asked herself the same one about 6 times in the last 4 minutes. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said, "and because I was already in the room." He looked at her for another long moment, then he said, "Can you stay?" The negotiation ran until 2 in the morning. Lena sat at the corner of the table that Ashford's legal team had hastily vacated. They just shuffled down 2 chairs each, like people making space on a bus, and she translated. Not just words. She translated tone, implication, the specific weight of pauses. When Kovalenko was being deliberately vague, she said so. When his second, a lean man named something she caught as Bodan, tried to reframe a point using a phrase that was technically accurate but contextually misleading, she interrupted him cleanly and said that a more precise translation would be this, and offered it. Kovalenko watched to the way a chess player watches an opponent who has just made an unexpected move. Not hostile. Calculating. Once, when Bodan pushed back on her translation, Kovalenko said something under his breath to the man beside him, too quiet for anyone to catch. Lena caught it. She didn't translate it. She wrote it on the notepad in front of her and slid it to Ashford, who read it without changing his expression and then turned the notepad face down. At 1:45 there was a break. The legal teams went to opposite ends of the room. Kovalenko's people clustered near the windows. Ashford's gathered near the door. Ashford came to stand beside her at the corner of the table. "You flagged the Bodan redirect," he said. It wasn't a question. He was trying to suggest the secondary clause only applies to the initial contract term, Lena said, keeping her voice down. "It doesn't. The original Ukrainian is unambiguous. He knows that." "Does Kovalenko know he knows that?" Lena thought about it. "Yes, Kovalenko sent him to try it. He's testing how closely you're following." Ashford looked across the room. Kovalenko was standing with his arms crossed, not looking at them, which was its own kind of attention. "You're doing remarkably well," Ashford said. "Considering." "Considering what?" He glanced at her. "That you came in here to empty the bins." "I didn't end up emptying the bins," she said. "So really, I've had a very unproductive evening." He didn't smile, exactly, but something in his face shifted, just slightly, in the way of a man who was deciding something. The break ended. They went back to the table. At 10 past midnight, Kovalov's legal team proposed a revision to the secondary clause, a revision that was better for Ashford's company, but not, Lena noted, as good as it could be. She watched Ashford's lead counsel start to nod. She set her pen down on the table. "Not loudly, just enough." Ashford caught it. He paused. He looked at her. She wrote 2 words on the notepad and slid it to him. "Not enough." He looked at the words. He looked at the revision on the table. Then he looked back at Kovalenko and said, pleasantly, that he appreciated the proposal, but he'd like to revisit one point before they proceeded. Kovalenko's expression didn't change, but he glanced at Lena. She held his look steadily. He said something in Ukrainian, too quiet for the table. She was meant to hear it. She was fairly certain she was meant to hear it. He said, "This one is sharp." She said, in Ukrainian, calmly, "Thank you." Half the room went very quiet. Kovalenko, for the first time all evening, looked delighted. They reached a final agreement at 1:45. It was better than the deal Ashford had walked into the room expecting. Significantly better. Kovalenko's team shook hands with the efficiency of people who respected a hard negotiation and didn't hold it personally against you, and by 2 in the morning the 42nd floor was emptying out. Lena put her notepad in her pocket. She went to the corner of the room and retrieved her cart from where she'd left it against the wall. She had about 40 minutes left in her shift if she moved quickly, which was not enough time to do the 42nd floor, which meant Danny was going to owe her one. "Mrs. Kovalchik." She turned. Ashford was standing in the middle of the emptying room. His legal team was still packing bags. His polished interpreter had left without saying anything to anyone. "Where did you learn Ukrainian?" he asked. "My grandmother," Lena said. "She came over from Kharkiv in 1979. She didn't speak much English for the first 10 years. So we spoke Ukrainian, and the other 6, French, Mandarin, Arabic, Polish, and German." She thought about it. "My French is better than my Arabic. My Arabic is better than my German. My German is fine. Where did you study?" She named the university. He didn't react, but she had the sense he recognized it. "Linguistics. I finished in 2017. I did a postgrad year in applied translation. Then the market was what it was." She paused. "I'm not complaining about the job. Meridian has a good benefits package." "I know you're not complaining," he said. He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to offer you a position." Lena looked at her mop bucket, then she looked at Rowan Ashford, who was looking at her with the expression of a man who had made up his mind. "Doing what?" she said. "I run a private acquisition firm," he said. 12 countries, 14 active contracts, 3 pending negotiations that require language capability beyond what my current team has. I need someone who can do what you did tonight. Across a table, in real time, not on paper. You have an interpreter," Lena said. She was very well dressed. She didn't catch the clause. There wasn't anything to say to that. It was just true. "I don't have a formal translation certificate," Lena said. "I have the degree and the postgrad, but I never sat the CTIC exam. If that matters for your contracts, I'll have my legal team review it. If there's an issue, we'll address it." He paused. "That's not the obstacle. Then what is?" He was quiet for a moment. "I need to know you can do this consistently. Tonight you were in a high-pressure room with significant stakes, and you performed well. That could be skill. It could also be adrenaline." "It's skill," Lena said, without heat. "Adrenaline doesn't teach you to read a secondary clause structure." He looked at her. "No," he said, "it doesn't. She should have gone home and slept on it. That was the reasonable thing to do. You didn't make major life decisions at 2 in the morning on the basis of 45 minutes in a boardroom with a man you didn't know." "What's the salary?" she said. He told her. She looked at her mop bucket again. Then she said, "I'll need to give Meridian 2 weeks' notice. Danny will need to arrange coverage." "Understood," he said. He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief. the handshake of a person who meant what they said. She noticed for the first time that he had a scar along the side of his right hand, thin and old, the kind you got a long time ago and stopped thinking about. She let go. She reached for her cart. "Kowalczyk," he said, and she stopped. It was the first time he'd used just her name, and there was something in the way he said it. Not familiar, not presumptuous, just precise. Like he was filing it somewhere accurate. "Thank you. You're welcome," she said. "Good luck with the ports." She did not finish the 42nd floor that night. She wheeled her cart into the elevator, pressed L for lobby, and stood in the mirrored box listening to the hum of the cable and thinking distantly that she was going to have to buy new work clothes. She found out later what Rowan Ashford was specifically, not just the acquisition firm. She'd known that much before she showed up Monday morning. She found out the rest the way you find out most things in this world, which is gradually, then all at once. The firm's name was Ashford Capital, and it had 12 offices across Canada and Europe. It did, as advertised, run 14 active contracts and 3 pending negotiations. What Lena had not fully understood until she was sitting in the staff briefing on her 3rd day was that several of those contracts involved counterparties who would not survive any kind of regulatory scrutiny, and that Ashford Capital's advantage in those dealings came not from legal acumen, but from the particular way that Rowan Ashford had moved through certain circles for approximately 15 years before he'd made the transition to legitimate enterprise. Her predecessor in the translation role, the polished woman from the night of the Ukrainian deal, had lasted 7 months before resigning, without explanation. The one before her had lasted 4. Lena found this out from Callum Hartley, the firm's operations manager, who told her with the cheerful transparency of a man who assumed she'd leave anyway, and therefore saw no reason not to be honest about the departure rate. He was a tall, amiable man from Fredericton who made excellent coffee and had a slight stutter when he was stressed, and Lena liked him immediately. "The last 2 left because of the hours," she guessed. "The hours," Callum said, and he paused. "The nature of some of the clients. I was in the room with Kovalenko," Lena said. "I know," he said. "That's why you're still here past day 3. She started to understand it in pieces. Ashford Capital was legal, fully, documentably, auditably legal, but it existed in proximity to things that were not, in the way that certain buildings in certain neighborhoods exist beside certain other buildings, and everyone understands the arrangement without saying so. Ashford himself was, as far as anyone could establish, clean. What he was good at was negotiating on behalf of people who needed someone clean in the room. Lena's job was to make sure that the things said in those rooms were accurately understood, not interpreted. Understood, there was a difference, she found, and Ashford was very particular about it. In her first 6 weeks, she sat in on negotiations in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. 2 of them were straightforward corporate dealings that could have been handled by any competent translator. One of them was a conversation in Russian and German that lasted 11 hours and involved a man who kept looking at Lena like he was waiting for her to make a mistake. She didn't make a mistake. The man whose name she was not told shook Ashford's hand at the end of the 11 hours and said something in Russian that her translation of was, "She's better than the last 3. Ashford said in English, "I know," and didn't explain how he'd understood. She asked him about it afterward. In the car back to the hotel. "You speak Russian," she said. "Some," he said. He was looking out the window. "Enough to know when someone's being accurate. You were checking me. I was always checking you," he said. It wasn't unkind. It was just precise, which she was coming to understand was the way he communicated most things. "I'm not checking you anymore." She looked at the city going by outside. "That was quick. You caught 3 redirects in the German section." Gruber's counsel kept using a term that technically translated as consideration, but contextually meant settlement. "You flagged it each time without being asked. It was the right translation." "Yes," he said. "That's the point. The trouble started, as trouble often does, not with the people you expected, but with the ones you thought you knew. 3 months in, there was a contract involving a Montreal-based developer named Gilles Terrian and a European logistics company whose primary language of operation was Polish. Lena translated. The contract moved forward. Ashford's firm took a substantial commission. 6 weeks after that contract closed, Lena found a discrepancy. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been reviewing files for a subsequent Polish language negotiation, and she'd pulled the Terrian contract as reference material. And there it was, a phrase in the Polish annex that she had translated one way, and that appeared in the final signed document, in a different way, subtly different. Not wrong, exactly, but not what she'd said. Someone had revised her translation after the fact. She sat with this for 2 days. She went through the contract 3 more times. She checked the revision history on the shared drive. The change had been made 12 days after the negotiation concluded, by an account whose name she didn't recognize, with access credentials that should not have existed. She brought it to Callum. He went very still in the way he did when he was stressed, and his coffee sat untouched. "Who else has access to finalized contract files?" she asked. He told her. It was a short list. The names on it were people she saw every day. "You should take this to Rowan," he said quietly. "I know," she said. And then, because she trusted Callum and she needed to say it to someone, what if Rowan already knows? Callum looked at her for a long moment. Then, he said carefully, "You'll need to decide what you want to do about that." She decided that night. She went through her own copies of her translation notes. She kept them, a habit from her postgrad year, and she compared them against the final documents in 4 more contracts. She found 2 more discrepancies, both small, both in the same direction. Language that appeared protective in her translation had been shifted, in the final versions, to language that was slightly less so. Not fraudulent on its face, but different. Someone was using her work as a baseline and then quietly adjusting it. She went to Ashford. His office was on the corner of the 44th floor, 2 floors up from where she'd met him. It had floor-to-ceiling windows and very little furniture. He was on a call when she knocked on the open door. He looked at her, said something brief into the phone, and ended the call. She put the 3 contracts on his desk. She had annotated them. Her original translations were highlighted in blue. The changed phrases were circled in red. She had typed up a 1-page summary that explained each discrepancy and what the change meant in context. Then she stood back and waited. He read. He read carefully and completely, the way she'd come to know he read everything, without rushing and without asking her to explain as he went. When he finished the summary, he looked up. "When did you find this?" 4 days ago, she said. "I verified it across 3 more contracts before I came to you. Why did you wait 4 days?" "I needed to know whether it was systematic," she said, "and I needed to know if you knew." Something moved across his face. "And I decided to assume you didn't," she said. "I could be wrong, but I decided to assume it." He was quiet. He looked back at the contracts. "You brought this to me before you brought it to anyone else." "I brought it to Callum first," she said. "Honestly, he told me to come to you. Callum's a good man." "Yes," she said. "He is." Ashford stood. He went to the window and stood there with his back to her for a moment, looking at the city below. Toronto on a Thursday afternoon in November, grey and rain-sheeted, the lake barely visible beyond the towers. He turned around. "The account that made the changes," he said. "You checked the access logs." "Yes, I can tell you who that account belongs to," he said. "It's my former legal director. He left the firm 8 weeks ago, officially by mutual agreement. He maintained ghost credentials on 3 of our document systems." A pause. "He's also currently consulting for 2 of the counterparties in those contracts." Lena felt the pieces fit together with the unpleasant click of something that had been wrong for a long time finally being named. "He was taking your legitimate deals and adjusting them to benefit your counterparties," she said. "And billing the counterparties for the service," Ashford said. "Yes. How long has this been going on?" "That's what I need to establish," he said. He looked at her. You've given me 3 contracts. I need someone who can go through the last 18 months of Polish and Russians and Jufe and identify every discrepancy accurately without the analysis being influenced by knowing in advance what I'm looking for. You want me to do a blind review. I want you to do a blind review, he said. Then I want you to be in the room when we take this to our legal team, and when we take it to his current clients. He paused. That last part will be a difficult conversation. I know, she said. It usually is. He looked at her for a moment with that particular quality of his, the stillness that meant something was being decided. You could have gone to the regulatory board, he said. Directly. That would have been simpler for you. It wouldn't have been accurate, she said. Going to the board before I understood the full picture would have been acting on incomplete information. I don't do that. No, he said quietly. You don't. The blind review took 2 weeks. She worked through it methodically, flagging everything that deviated from standard translation practice, without knowing in advance which contracts were affected. At the end of 2 weeks, she had found 9 discrepancies across 7 contracts, spanning 14 months. She'd also found, in the last 3 contracts before the legal director's departure, the discrepancies starting to grow larger, less subtle, more significant, as if he'd been running out of time, or starting to feel undetectable. Ashford reviewed her findings. His legal team reviewed them. They brought in outside counsel. The process was careful and slow, and not particularly dramatic from where Lena was sitting, because her part was already done. What happened afterward happened in rooms she wasn't always in. She understood the shape of it, from what Callum told her, what she inferred, and one conversation she had with Ashford in the small kitchen off the 38th floor at 7 in the morning, when she'd come in early and he was already there, which was not unusual, because he was always already there. He said, "It's going to settle." She poured coffee. For how much? More than it would have cost him to just do his job, Ashford said. He looked tired in the particular way of someone who had been managing a situation for weeks and was now watching it resolve without satisfaction. The counterparties are cooperating. They claim they didn't know the revisions were unauthorized. Do you believe them? He said. But I can't prove it. And it's not what I need. He paused. What I need is the contracts to be made right and the access credentials to be gone, and this not to happen again. The first 2 are straightforward, Lena said. The third one depends on whether you change how document access is managed after final sign-off. I know, he said. That's a process problem. I'm addressing it. She nodded. She drank her coffee. He said without preamble, I owe you an apology. She looked at him. When you were hired, he said, my concern was whether you could sustain performance under pressure. That was legitimate. What was less legitimate was that I didn't. He stopped. Started again. I ran background checks on the previous 2 translators. I ran one on you. Yours was more thorough. I had someone verify your degree, your post-grad year, your previous employment. In detail, because I came from Meridian Services, she said. Not a question. Yes, he said. She considered this. It wasn't comfortable. It also wasn't entirely surprising. Did you find anything concerning? She said. Rowan, she said. And it was the first time she'd used his name, and she saw him notice it. Checking someone's credentials is due diligence. That's reasonable. What you're apologizing for is something else. He was quiet. You checked them more thoroughly because you didn't expect me to be what I am, she said. Because I walked in with a mop bucket and I don't look the way you expected someone in this role to look. That's what you're apologizing for. He met her eyes. Yes, accepted, she said. Don't do it again. I won't, he said, and then, for what it's worth, I was wrong. In the way I assumed, not in what I found. I know, she said. You wouldn't have kept me otherwise. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in that look she was starting to know the name for, though she was not yet ready to say it. No, he said quietly, I wouldn't. Winter settled over the city. The Kovalenko contract closed successfully. 2 new Polish-language deals came in, and then a French-language negotiation out of Montreal involving a company whose primary counterparty was in Dakar, which meant Lena's French got an extended workout, and she spent 3 evenings brushing up on West African commercial law with a focus that reminded her, pleasantly, of her post-grad year. She bought new work clothes, not because she'd been told to, but because she'd been paid enough to, and she found she liked the particular confidence of walking into a room in something that fit properly and had been chosen on purpose. She kept the Meridian Services badge in her desk drawer. She wasn't entirely sure why. It seemed important not to throw it away. She and Callum started having lunch on Fridays, which became the informal tradition of the floor. He brought his terrible homemade sandwiches. She brought coffee from the good place on King Street. He told her about Fredericton and his daughter, who wanted to be a marine biologist, and she told him about her grandmother's kitchen in Etobicoke and learning Ukrainian by listening to old radio programs on a cassette player that had stopped working in 2003. She didn't tell him about the look in Rowan Ashford's office. There wasn't anything to tell yet. There was only the look itself, and the fact that it had started appearing in places that were not quite professional, at moments that were not quite accidental, and that she had stopped pretending not to notice it. The thing about being underestimated for long enough is that you stop expecting to be seen. You stop waiting for it. You construct a life inside the space you've been allocated, which is smaller than it should be, always slightly smaller than it should be, and you find ways to be useful and content, and to notice things, which you do quietly because nobody is particularly interested in what you notice. And then something cracks open in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, and there you are, standing in someone's boardroom with rubber gloves and a wrong floor shift, translating a crisis at 2 in the morning, and the look on the man's face across the table is not dismissal, not pity, not the particular blankness of someone who has decided you don't register. It is the look of a man who is paying attention. Lena had spent a long time thinking she didn't particularly want to be paid attention to. She understood now that she'd been wrong about that. She'd just been waiting for someone who knew how. On a Thursday in January, there was a late meeting that ran until 9. By the time the building had cleared out, it was just the 2 of them on the 44th floor. Lena going through a French contract at the table in the small conference room, Ashford finishing something in his office with the door open. He came to the doorway of the conference room at 9:15 and said, "Leave that." She looked up. "I'll order food," he said. "From the Thai place, if you want." She looked at the contract. Then she looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, and he looked, not for the first time, not the last, like a man who was asking her something more than what he'd said. "Green curry," she said. "Medium, not mild." "I know," he said, and she realized with a small certain shock that he did know, that he'd been paying attention to that too. She closed the contract. He smiled. It was the first time she'd seen him smile, really smile, and it landed somewhere she didn't have a clean professional name for, which was fine. She had 6 other languages she hadn't tried yet. There was plenty of time.